something that's, kind of bitchy.
Bitty bitchy. Bitchy? I know. It was just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Welcome to Bitchy History, where we cut through the myths and nostalgia to get to the raw, unvarnished truth about the past. With sharp analysis, a feminist lens, and just the right amount of bitchiness, we're here to show you that history isn't just something to study, it's something to question. Let's get started. Welcome back to Bitchy History, where we find that even science can fall prey to the patriarchy. Last time, we saw how theology and philosophy built the blueprint for patriarchy, but by the 19th century, the pulpit was getting kind of crowded, and the Enlightenment was promising reason, logic, objectivity, which sounded great in theory until you realized who was doing the reasoning. The priests might have lost their time in the spotlight, somewhat, but the professors got laboratories, and suddenly the power to define woman was not divine, it was data-driven. In this new world, the tools of salvation changed. Out went the Bible and holy water, in came calipers, microscopes, and skull-measuring tools. And make no mistake, the same anxiety that once burned witches at the stake was now burning through academic journals. The Victorian age was obsessed with hierarchy. It was an empire of classification, every rock, bird, skull sorted neatly into ranks that always somehow ended with white European men at the top. Plants were cataloged, animals were dissected, races were ranked, and the sexes were conveniently arranged in a binary with absolutely no wiggle room. When Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he rocked the foundations of how humans understood creation. But when he turned his evolutionary gaze towards humans in The Descent of Man in 1871, his radical edge softened into domestic. He imagined evolution as a battlefield where men's courage, intellect, and competitiveness drove civilization forward, while women's patience and beauty kept the species looking good in portraits. It was survival of the fittest, rewritten as a Victorian marriage manual. The unspoken assumption was clear. Men built civilization, women decorated it. Darwin's peers happily followed his lead. Herbert Spencer, philosopher and pioneer of social Darwinism, warned that women possessed only a limited reserve of biological energy. If too much of this went into thinking, not enough would remain for their natural reproductive duties. Education, he believed, would lead to infertility and national collapse. Imagine standing before a room of young women and explaining with a straight face that them doing algebra homework might doom the British Empire. By the 1870s, Spencer's theory had a medical ally in Dr. Edward Clark, a Harvard physician who published Sex in Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls, a title that promised equality but delivered social panic. Clark claimed that women's reproductive organs were too delicate to withstand higher learning. Studying, he said, would divert vital energy from the uterus to the brain, producing monstrous brains and puny uteruses. I'm quoting. It was the 19th century equivalent of saying, "Don't worry your pretty little head about it." Clark's book was a bestseller and quickly became ammunition for university boards that were determined to keep women out. But not everyone accepted this as gospel. In 1875, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, the first woman ordained as a Protestant minister and one of the earliest feminist scientists, decided that she'd had enough of men using nature as an excuse for patriarchy. Her book, The Sexes Throughout Nature, took direct aim at Darwin and Spencer, whom she called the two most influential living men. She knew it would be seen as audacious for a woman to critique the high priests of evolution, but as she put it, the disadvantages under which women are placed are never lessened by waiting. Blackwell didn't reject evolution, but she reclaimed it for women. She accused Darwin and Spencer of dressing up old social prejudices as biological law, what she called defrauded womanhood. Their theories, she argued, condemned humanity to forever retarding its own advancement, because a society that refused to promote a genuine, broad, and healthful equilibrium of the sexes was sabotaging its own evolution. In other words, if half your species is stuck in the nursery, don't act surprised when civilization doesn't grow up. Blackwell's critique marked one of the first feminist confrontations with the so-called neutrality of science. She saw what her male contemporaries couldn't or wouldn't, that the real flaw in evolution wasn't biology, it was bias. Her warning went unheeded, of course. Instead of correcting their methods, her male peers doubled down. Darwin's shaky gender logic became the cornerstone of an entire intellectual movement dedicated to proving that women were biologically unfit for public life. This was the golden age of what historians now call scientific anti-feminism, a polite term for men discovering new ways to explain why women shouldn't exist outside the home. The French physician Paul Broca weighed brains, literally, believing that the smaller female skull proved smaller intellect. The fact that women's bodies are smaller overall didn't seem to complicate his data set for some reason. For Broca, the numbers confirmed what society already knew. It was a perfect feedback loop. Measure, misinterpret, publish, repeat. Across Europe, phrenologists were reading skulls the way astrologers read star charts. Each bump and hollow supposedly revealed character, courage, intellect, and ambition clustered conveniently around the male brow, while devotion and tenderness nestled in the female temple. The entire exercise was a Rorschach test for cultural bias. Phrenology was just astrology for men with calipers. Victorian science wasn't content to confine its fantasies to humans either. As the Smithsonian has noted, even biologists projected gender roles onto the animal kingdom. Male birds were described as bold and adventurous, females as coy and nurturing. Bees became paragons of self-sacrificing motherhood. Lions were symbols of masculine dominance. Nature, viewed through a patriarchal lens, conveniently reflected the same story that society told about itself. But this objective science of difference had one more trick. It turned cultural norms into biological destiny. The entire Victorian worldview depended on the idea that hierarchy was natural. If women seemed less rational, it was because evolution designed them that way. If men dominated public life, it was because nature rewarded strength and intellect in men. The logic was circular but seductive. Men ruled because they were fit to rule, and their rule proved their fitness. The irony is that many of these ideas were born in an age of supposed progress. The 19th century loved to congratulate itself on replacing superstition with evidence, but it simply traded one kind of faith for another. Where earlier centuries feared witches and temptresses, Victorians feared educated women and social change. The instruments changed, the panic stayed the same. Of course, women weren't passive in this story. Across Europe, they pushed back against the notion that intellect was an evolutionary liability. Cambridge's Girton College opened its doors to women, sparking outrage and endless debates about female ability. In Zurich, women from across Europe, nicknamed Zurich girls, pursued medical degrees and often outperformed their male peers. Shocker. Russian students, in particular, became famous for their skill in defiance, scandalizing polite society simply by existing as competent doctors. Every lecture they attended was an act of rebellion against the myth of feminine frailty. Still, the machinery of science kept on grinding. In laboratories and lecture halls, men continued to weigh, measure, and dissect, seeking proof that the social order was inevitable. Phrenologists mapped virtue onto skulls, anatomists measured pelvises to prove that childbirth defined a woman's destiny. Physicians wrote textbooks warning that education or ambition would warp the female body. Each new discovery only reinforced the same conclusion. The world, they insisted, was exactly as it should be. Behind the polished brass of the microscope and the gleaming glass of the specimen jar, the old fears still pulsed. The fear of women who knew too much. As Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English remind us, the professionalization of medicine didn't just exclude women, it erased their history. The midwives and healers of earlier centuries, once branded witches, were now dismissed as superstitious relics. Their knowledge, repackaged in Latin, became the foundation of modern obstetrics and gynecology, minus the women who created it. The witch's herbs became the doctor's prescriptions, and the healer became the hysteric. But we'll be talking more about the history of women, witchcraft, and medicine in a future episode. By the end of the 19th century, the scientific establishment had accomplished something extraordinary. It transformed prejudice into principle and social anxiety into natural law. Gender wasn't just enforced by religion or etiquette, it was encoded in the body, written into bone and muscle, and declared eternal by men in white coats. And that brings us to the next phase of the scam. Once women had been measured and classified, the next logical step was to diagnose them. If the Victorians had proven, at least to themselves, that women were physically and intellectually inferior, the 20th century would take the project further. It would pathologize them. Because when science finishes defining what a woman is, the next question it can't resist asking is, what's wrong with her? Once science had decided what a woman was supposed to be, delicate, emotional, ruled by her reproductive organs, it naturally followed that any deviation from that script must be illness. What began as a classification system turned into a diagnostic manual. Women weren't just different from men, they were defective versions of them. The late 19th century gave birth to modern psychiatry, and with it a new way to name and manage female rebellion. The The most famous diagnosis of all, hysteria, had ancient roots. The word came from the word in Greek hystera, meaning uterus, because doctors literally believed the womb could wander about the body, causing chaos. A headache? The uterus had floated upward. Melancholy? It was pressing on the heart. Disobedience? Anger? Ennui? All from a uterus getting uppity and not knowing its place. Victorian medicine gave this ancient superstition a facelift. Instead of blaming wandering body parts, doctors now blamed the nerves. Hysteria became the catch-all explanation for any woman who was inconvenient. Too sad, too loud, too sexual, too ambitious. The male imagination of the era could envision the expansion of empire, railways, and electricity, but not the idea of a woman having an independent emotional life. In Paris, the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot turned hysteria into high art. At a hospital in Paris, which has a very, very French name, and I will not embarrass myself attempting to pronounce it, he staged weekly clinical demonstrations where women were hypnotized, prodded, and photographed in the throes of so-called hysteric fits. These performances were invitation only, attended by doctors, artists, and even writers like a young Sigmund Freud. The women, often poor or institutionalized, became a medical spectacle, their suffering repackaged as scientific discovery. It was less medicine than theater, the doctor as director, the patient as performer, and the audience applauding their own superiority. Freud, in particular, really took these lessons to heart and turned hysteria into theory. He agreed that women's symptoms, paralysis, anxiety, fainting, were real, but he reinterpreted them as manifestations of repressed desire. It was no longer the womb that wandered, but the libido. Freud's famous case studies made female pain into the backdrop for his philosophy. Women's minds were battlegrounds of sexuality and submission, their neuroses proof of their fragile nature. The difference between theology and psychoanalysts, it turned out, was mostly vocabulary. The sinner had become the patient, and the confessional was now a consulting room with a couch. But not all treatments involve talking. Across the Atlantic, American neurologist Weir Mitchell offered what he called the rest cure. His method was simple. Isolate the patient, forbid her to read or write, feed her a diet of milk and meat, and keep her in bed until she submitted to domestic tranquility. It was prescribed for depression, anxiety, and basically any case of female dissatisfaction with her lot in life. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's was one of his patients, and her horror story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was barely fiction. In it, the narrator, trapped in her bedroom by her well-meaning doctor/husband, begins to see a woman crawling behind the wallpaper. By the end, she tears down the paper to free the figure, only to realize the imprisoned woman was herself. Gilman's story was a feminist exorcism disguised as fiction, a mirror held up to medical cruelty that women faced regularly. As Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English point out in their book Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, the rise of male medicine coincided with the systematic sidelighting of women's own healing traditions. The same culture that had once burned midwives as witches now confined their granddaughters to asylums for talking too much. Knowledge of the body, once communal, practical, and female, was replaced by a male profession that pathologized its subjects. Medicine had moved from persecuting women to patronizing them, which was progress only if you ignore the continued power imbalance. By the early 1900s, the language of diagnosis expanded beyond hysteria into a more ambitious project, defining normality itself. This was the age of eugenics. Psychologists and physicians sought to engineer the perfect population, which required classifying not just diseases, but entire groups of people. Working class, immigrant, and black women were targeted for sterilization in the name of social hygiene, while middle class white women were told that motherhood was their patriotic duty. Feminine virtue was rebranded as a matter of national survival. Meanwhile, the emerging fields of sexology and psychology took aim at sexuality itself. Writers like Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing cataloged sexual behavior with the zeal of butterfly collectors, labeling anything outside of heterosexual reproduction as pathological. Homosexuality became inversion, female pleasure without men was frigidity, and gender variance was treated as deformity. What had once been called sin and temptation was now neuroses and deviation. Same control, different naming structure. As the 20th century dawned, the pathologizing evolved. Women were blamed for everything from social unrest to male anxiety. A nervous woman was a familiar trope in both literature and medicine. Her fragility a moral lesson, her breakdown a cautionary tale. The trend reached its absurd peak in the 1930s and 40s when American magazines and medical journals began to fret about the frigidity of women. Women who didn't enjoy sex, or enjoyed it too much, were pathologized as maladjusted. If Freud's generation had seen the problem as repression, the interwar years saw it as competition. Women who worked, studied, or sought independence were accused of masculinizing themselves and demasculating men in turn. In one 1940 medical text, a psychiatrist warned that excessive education and self-assertion led to psychosexual confusion. The evidence? Increasing divorce rates and women who said no to men, basically. Science was no longer pretending to discover truth, it was enforcing conformity. Pseudoscientific gender theory served the same function as religion once had. It gave patriarchy the glow of inevitability. Women's behavior could now be graphed, measured, and corrected. And when medicine wasn't busy diagnosing women individually, it was diagnosing society through them. The modern woman became a national obsession, the symbol of everything that could go wrong if boundaries blurred and binaries broke down. Then came the Second World War, which scrambled gender in ways the Victorians could never have imagined. Women had worked in factories, flown planes, and built weapons while men went away to war. Rosie the Riveter flexed her bicep in posters, a national icon of competence and strength, and for a few brief years it looked as if that revolution might last. But when the soldiers came home, Rosie was told to put down a rivet gun and pick up a spatula. The GI Bill sent men to college and into management. Women were politely shown the door. America in particular felt it needed a reset when it came to gender roles, and the Cold War provided it. Domestic containment became the national strategy, not just for communism, but for gender. A happy housewife in a suburban kitchen was suddenly the front line of democracy. The enemy was no longer abroad, but inside. The unfeminine woman, the career wife, the mother who didn't smile enough. In the new psychology of the atomic age, every family was a microcosm of the state, and women's compliance was civic duty. Psychiatrists stepped into the role of moral arbiters. They warned that women who rejected traditional roles were maladjusted, and the men who tolerated them were emasculated. The 1947 bestseller Modern Woman, the Lost Sex crystallized this panic. Its authors, journalist Ferdinand Lundberg and psychiatrist Mariana Farnham, diagnosed the working woman as a danger to civilization. They insisted that female independence led to neuroses, that career ambition produced frigidity, and that the only cure for female anxiety was marriage and motherhood. The book became a post-war bestseller and a psychological blueprint for the 1950s domestic ideal. I own a copy. It's in the top 5 worst books I've ever read. It was Freud with a patriotic twist, sexual repression framed as national defense. Magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping spread the gospel of a domestic science. Entire articles instructed readers on scientific homemaking, complete with charts and checklists to optimize kitchen efficiency and marital happiness. Housewives were urged to schedule their chores, track their menstrual cycles, and even monitor their smiles. The language is modern, but the message was medieval. Control your emotions, serve your family, and you'll be healthy. Step out of line, and you're sick. By the middle of the 20th century, something extraordinary had happened. After a century of measuring and diagnosing women, science had finally perfected its product, the normal woman. She was calm, married, fertile, smiling all the time. She was not hysterical, not ambitious, and definitely not asking for equal pay. The scientists had done their work. Now the advertisers, politicians, and psychiatrists would have to make sure she stayed that way. Companies hired psychologists to sell femininity back to women as aspiration. Lipstick ads promised confidence, vacuum cleaners offered fulfillment. Hormone science soon found its role in the performance. In the post-war years, estrogen became the miracle cure for everything from menopause to nervousness. Don't worry, we'll get to the other miracle cure of meth and tranquilizers in a future episode. Medical journals and women's magazines alike advertised hormone therapy as the secret to staying young and desirable. The same scientific establishment that had once warned against overusing the female brain now advised women to regulate their moods chemically for their husband's comfort. Patriarchy, always adaptable, had learned to monetize biology. Then came the cultural reinforcements. Hollywood picked up where psychiatry left off. The perfect 1950s woman was either the radiant housewife or the doomed career girl. In films like Calamity Jane or The Best of Everything, independent, tomboyish women inevitably found happiness only by choosing femininity and love over work. Marilyn Monroe embodied the era's paradox, brilliant, self-aware, and trapped in the caricature of the dumb blonde. The more intelligent she became off-screen, the more Hollywood punished her for it. Television brought this fantasy right into the American living room. Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Each week, millions of viewers tuned in to watch tidy families with docile mothers who always had fresh-baked cookies and fathers who dispensed sage moral advice while smoking his pipe. Domestic bliss was patriotic, and laughter was ideological lubrication for it. These weren't just comedies, they were cultural training films, a weekly reminder of what happiness was supposed to look like. Psychiatry, marketing, and media all worked from the same manual, femininity as a prescription. Any divergence, too ambitious, too queer, too discontented, was framed as disorder. Homosexuality remained in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders as sexual deviation, and women's dissatisfaction with domestic life was labeled a neuroses. Betty Friedan would later call it the problem that has no name, but in truth it had plenty of names. Hysteria, frigidity, maladjustment, anxiety, loneliness, penis envy. The labels changed, the logic didn't. By the mid-1950s, the binary had been polished to a very high gloss. Masculinity was strength and reason, femininity was emotion and beauty, anything in between was pathology. The same culture that sold pink vacuums and hormone pills also waged moral crusades against sexual deviance. The Lavender Scare targeted queer Americans as threats to national security. Newspapers warned of mannish women and soft men corrupting the moral order. Every era has its witch hunt, and this one just swapped torches for tabloids. The irony was that all this pseudoscientific posturing, psychological profiles, hormone charts, color theory, was supposed to represent progress? Humanity had landed jets, split atoms, and mapped DNA, yet half the population was still being defined by mood swings and kitchen colors. After centuries of sermons and scalpels, science hadn't liberated women from superstition, it had just modernized it. But cracks were forming in the pastel perfection. In 1948, Alfred Kinsey published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, followed by Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. His data demolished the myth of a chaste binary world. Women, it turned out, were having sex, lots of it, and not always with men. The public reaction bordered on actual hysteria, proving that Victorian panic was alive and well in the atomic age. The establishment tried to dismiss Kinsey's work as immoral and dangerous, and the truth was, it was dangerous. It revealed that categories that science had worked so hard to enforce for centuries were leaking at the seams. Within a decade, those leaks would become a flood. The 1960s and 70s would bring feminist revolt, queer activism, and the return of the witch as a symbol of resistance. But that's a story for another episode. Because when patriarchy's old theories start to wear thin, it doesn't admit failure. It rebrands. The scientist becomes the psychologist becomes the advertiser becomes the podcast bro, and the same message keeps getting repackaged. Be smaller, quieter, prettier, smile, take your vitamins, buy the pink version. The mid-20th century didn't invent gender, it just industrialized it. That's it for this episode of Bitchy History. If you enjoyed the show, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, review, and share it with someone who loves history as much as we do. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the world around you.
History.
History. What a bitch, right?